16 children found in unimaginable conditions.
Most of our livestock was kept in better conditions than the children.
The kids forced to live in a 12 by 12 room in rural Ohio, starved, neglected, illiterate, and according to the Attorney General, some even unable to speak.
It looked like almost feral animals. It was terrible.
16 kids, one room, 12 feet by 12 feet, and nobody knew. Stop for a second and just sit with that. Not let that sink in. Just sit with it. 16 children, from a baby barely walking to an 18-year-old, packed into a space smaller than most people's living rooms and the neighbors down the road. They had no idea. None. You already know what I'm about to say next, don't you? You already feel it in your gut. Something doesn't add up here. And look, that instinct you have right now, the one telling you this story is bigger than what they're showing you on the news, that instinct is correct. We all knew something like this was happening somewhere in this country. We just didn't know where. We didn't know it would be Vinton County, Ohio, one of the poorest, smallest counties in the entire state, tucked into Appalachia, population under 13,000 people.
Let's begin with a scene setter. Today's scandal takes us to Vinton County, Ohio, a small county with a population less than 13,000. Here's Ohio prosecutor and former Deputy Attorney General Mark Weaver.
This is Southern Ohio. This is Appalachia. That doesn't excuse anything. It's just explanatory.
A place most Americans couldn't find on a map, and that's exactly why it happened there. Not despite the fact that nobody was watching. Because of it. Here's the thing, though. Before we even get into the horror inside that house, and there is horror, real documented horror, we need to talk about the part of this story that nobody wants to talk about. The part that got buried under headlines about feral children and livestock comparisons. The search warrant, the one document that started all of this. And guess what? It's sealed. Locked away. Nobody, not the defense attorneys, not the public, not even the people demanding answers, gets to see it. Doesn't that strike you as strange? A warrant gets executed on a rural Ohio home, supposedly connected to some minor indecent exposure charges, and instead what officers find is 16 children living in conditions the state's own attorney general called pure evil. Pure evil. That's not my phrase. That's his, and yet the very document that gave them legal permission to walk through that door, in the first place, is hidden from view.
I've been doing these types of cases for a long time. I spent a big portion of my career dedicated to prosecuting these types of cases. And I can tell you this is pure evil. What we saw down here today is pure evil. And I have to commend the deputies from the Vinton County Sheriff's Office and our agents from Ohio BCI and I who went into really kind of one of the worst environments that I've seen in my career.
I need you to stay with me here because this detail matters more than almost anything else in this entire case. Gary Siders Jr., 30, 6 years old, facing 4 misdemeanor counts of public indecency for incidents between May 23rd and May 31st. That's what the public was told led investigators to that house. But defense attorney Dorian Ball, representing Gary Sr., came right out and said it doesn't make sense. His words, not mine.
But that's not what the search warrant was related to. Here's Gary Sr.'s attorney Dorian Ball.
It would seem pretty odd for a couple of misdemeanor counts of indecent exposure to generate the type of response that happened at this house. I would also be very interested to see what this search warrant said, what the basis for the search warrant was, how they were able to obtain such a search warrant, because I have a hard time believing, first of all, if all it was an arrest warrant, then none of this could have happened. So clearly it wasn't just those charges, because if it were, they would have a simple arrest warrant, they would ask for Mr. Siders Jr. to come out, and that would have been the end of it. So obviously there was more there. I'm sure that I and all of my other colleagues who are representing the co-defendants will all be very interested to see what the basis for the search warrant was.
He said it would be, quote, pretty odd for a couple of misdemeanor counts of indecent exposure to generate the type of response that happened at this house. And he's right. Think about it. A misdemeanor doesn't usually get you a full tactical response from multiple counties. It doesn't get you the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation showing up. It doesn't get you the fire department. The EMS from 2 different counties and the state attorney general's office all descending on one rural property in Appalachia. So what were they really looking for? Nobody's telling us. And that's the first breadcrumb in this whole thing right at the start, sitting there like a splinter you can't quite pull out.
It's really kind of wild because the Vinton County Sheriff's Office, and they were being assisted by the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which is not uncommon in that area because these are smaller law enforcement agencies. They got a search warrant and they went there to investigate and look for evidence of some sort of crime. And I think because these 4 misdemeanor public indecency counts were filed against Gary Jr. on the same date the search warrant was executed, people kind of thought, oh, it's related to that. I've been told it's not part of that misdemeanor case, that this is something else. What that something else is, I wish I could tell you. I don't know, because the search warrant affidavit, that's the document they supply to the judge in order to say, look, we have probable cause. You need to give us the warrant. That's sealed. The search warrant is also sealed. I have the order sealing both of these documents. And nobody knows why they went there. But what we do know is that when they went in to serve the search warrant and to execute the search warrant, they were surprised when they found these children all kind of huddled, I guess, in a room together. So that was not something they expected to find when they went into the house. So the initial investigation, why they went to the home, that remains a mystery. And who was the target of that investigation, that also remains a mystery.
Now let's talk about who found these kids in, because this is where it gets interesting. This is where the story stops being a headline and starts being something you feel in your chest. The officers who walked into that home that day, they weren't expecting what they found. They went in for a search warrant related to something else entirely. And instead they walked into a room, 12 by 12, where 16 children had apparently been living for years. Some of them couldn't speak. Some of them, according to officials, looked, and I'm quoting here because this detail is burned into my mind, like almost feral animals. Feral. Let that word sit on your tongue for a second. That's not a word law enforcement uses lightly. That's not a word a career prosecutor throws around for a press conference soundbite. Mark Weaver, the Ohio prosecutor and former deputy attorney general who's been commenting on this case, made it clear this isn't normal even for Appalachia, even for one of the poorest regions in the state. Families with 7, 8, 10 kids, sure, you see that sometimes down there. But 16, confined to one room, that's not culture, that's not poverty.
One of the poorest counties in Ohio.
For the past 4 years, Vinton County, Ohio has been home to the Siders family. 73-year-old Gary Siders Sr., his wife, 67-year-old Christina Siders, who goes by the name Lynn, their son, 36-year-old Gary Siders Jr., and his wife, 33-year-old Elizabeth Siders. On June 30th, a search warrant was executed on their home in Vinton County. And there's been some confusion here. Some reports initially said the warrant was related to Gary Jr.'s public indecency charge. And Gary does face that allegation for 4 reported incidents between May 23rd and May 31st.
That's something else entirely. And here's where I want you to really pay attention. Because this next part, this is the unlikely hero of this whole story. And it's not who you think. It's Elizabeth Siders, the mother. Now, before you get angry at me, before you type something in the comments about how a mother of 16 children living in filth cannot possibly be a victim, just wait. Give me a minute, because I had the same reaction. I did. I sat with this case for days trying to make it make sense, and I kept coming back to one detail that changed everything for me. Elizabeth was 15 years old when she had her first child. 15. She married Gary Jr., who was 18 at the time, and because Ohio wouldn't allow a 15-year-old to marry, they crossed the state line into West Virginia where with parental approval, it was legal. Let that wash over you for a second. A child crossing state lines to become somebody's wife because the laws in one state said no and the laws right next door said yes. Her uncle-in-law told a local television station that Elizabeth, quote, did not have a very good home life when they got together and she escaped to Lynn, Christina, and Gary's house, which was back then a normal American home. She escaped into this.
The parents here are Gary Jr. and Elizabeth, only 36 and 33 respectively, and that means Elizabeth was only 15 years old when she had her first baby. This came just months after she married Gary Jr. And you heard that right, by the way, married. This was back in 2008. Elizabeth was 15 years old and Gary Jr. was 18. Now, it wasn't legal to get married in Ohio for someone only 15, but just across the border in West Virginia, Elizabeth was legally allowed to get married with parental approval, so she did. Elizabeth's uncle-in-law told local TV station WOWK13, quote, "She did not have a very good home life when they got together, and she escaped to Lynn, Christina, and Gary's house, which was back then a normal American home."
And look, here's the thing though. Her own brother Jeremy has come forward publicly on social media of all places and used the word indoctrination. He said his sister was indoctrinated. He posted, and again, I'm reading this because the actual wording matters, that she wrapped her life up due to indoctrination, that it was 100% real. He's angry. He describes meeting Gary Jr. once and being disturbed by him. Soft hands. Never worked a day in his life. He said he thought about, in his words, taking him out that night. Now, indoctrinated into what exactly, nobody knows. And that's become number 2. Because when you hear a family member use a word like that, a word usually reserved for cults, for extremist groups, for controlled environments where somebody loses their sense of self, you have to ask the question everybody in this case seems afraid to ask out loud. Was this a cult?
Elizabeth's brother Jeremy has claimed that she was indoctrinated. And we'll talk about this more with Aunt Jeanette. We're not really sure what that meant. I mean, indoctrinated into what? We can take some clues from his social media posts, though. On June 30th, he wrote, quote, "My sister just wrapped her life up due to indoctrination. It is 100% real. 20 kids and younger than me. The math equals immature piece of explicit man involved. I met this dude a couple months ago. Shook my hand like a baby would. Super soft hands. Definitely never worked a day in his life. I should have took him out that night. I was thinking about it, but my sister, I was happy to see. Been 15 years. You lost touch with your family, followed another. Look what happened."
Christina Siders, who goes by Lynn, has a Facebook page full of religious imagery. Crosses, the Lord's Prayer, references to Jesus. And Elizabeth's own attorney has said that when he spoke with her, she told him that children are children. All children are a blessing from God. That's the phrase he used. Not we made mistakes. Not things got out of hand. A blessing from God, 16 times over.
I've often wondered, too, is there a religious component to all of this?
Right.
Because Christina Siders, who goes by Lynn, I know you mentioned that earlier, on her Facebook account, there's a lot of imagery of God, Jesus, crosses, the Lord's Prayer.
Okay.
Is there a religious component here? And Tommy Stolley, I just saw a recent interview with him. He's the attorney representing Elizabeth. He said he spoke with her and, talked about all these children. And he claims she said they always wanted a big family. I mean, this is like a big family on steroids.
Right.
This is not just a big family. This is a huge family. And he said that she said that children are a blessing from God. All children are a blessing from God.
Okay.
So I'm kind of at a loss as to what is going on here. Is there a religious component here? I don't know.
That is a huge question a lot of people have. When I'm just talking to my friends about this case, everyone has said cult, religion, what's going on here? And I think that's one of the things we got to keep following this case to see.
Here's where I need to slow down for a second. I need to just be with me here quietly, because this next part isn't about outrage. It's not about justice or corruption or cover-ups. It's about something smaller and sadder than all of that. Somewhere in Ohio right now, there's an 18-year-old girl who officials believe couldn't spell her own name.
And I also want to note there has been some discussion about the oldest person at age 18 being considered a child. Here's what officials have to say about that.
The young person's mental capacity, she is, we believe, developmentally disabled. Couldn't even spell her name at 18, and so she is developmentally still a minor.
And that leads to the condition of all 16 kids.
Not because she's incapable, because nobody ever taught her. She was never enrolled in school, never given the chance. And when investigators found her, they classified her developmentally as still a minor because the woman inside that 18-year-old body never got the childhood that would have let her grow past that age in any way that mattered. She was a child pretending to be an adult, trapped in a house pretending to be a home.
Some of these children couldn't even speak. Yeah, so, I mean, we're talking, this is very, it was terrible. I mean, it looked like almost feral animals. It was terrible. So when we're talking reading and writing and education.
I don't know about you, but that detail is the one that keeps me up. Not the feces, not the bugs, not the smell that one deputy said he still couldn't get off his skin a full day later. It's that girl, 18 years old. Couldn't spell her own name. Okay, let's pick the pace back up because there's more here, and it gets more complicated, not less. The Ohio Attorney General, standing in front of cameras, called this the worst scene he's encountered in his entire career, a career he says has been largely dedicated to prosecuting exactly these kinds of cases. He said their livestock was kept in better conditions than these children. He described children covered in bugs, squatting with what he called a distant look in their eyes, comparing it, almost involuntarily, to old commercials about suffering overseas, except this wasn't overseas, this was rural Ohio. This was America, right now, in 2026. But here's the breadcrumb that changes the shape of this whole story. The defense is pushing back. Hard. Dorian Ball, again representing Gary Sr., said flatly that he's seen the inside of that house, and the Attorney General has not. He accused the state's top law enforcement official of getting his information secondhand, of making, quote, hyperbolic, extravagant statements for a press conference he wasn't personally present to verify. He went further. He said what's really happening here is that impoverished people are being criminalized for being poor, not abusive. Poor.
When I see a press conference where the state AG is making these hyperbolic, extravagant statements about what he saw, where the sheriff is talking about livestock, is just simply, it's beyond disingenuous, frankly. It appears to me, from what I understand, that these people are really just trying to criminalize poverty and an extremely impoverished family. As many people in the media have already noted.
Now here's where it gets interesting. Because if these kids were truly as illiterate and isolated as officials first suggested, if they were truly cut off from the world entirely, how did investigators find Facebook accounts and Snapchat pages belonging to at least 2, possibly 3 of the older children? How does a child supposedly unable to speak or write end up with private messages to someone described as an internet boyfriend overseas?
And have already discovered the kids who have been described as feral, been described as illiterate. It's my understanding that as the internet does what it does, it's come out that these older kids had social media pages, Facebook pages, Snapchat pages, which speaks to a couple of things. Number one, if they're so illiterate, how are they posting things online? Number two, if these are kids who are trapped in this place, how are they able to have... Typically, when you see cases where people are trapped or they're not allowed to go do things freely.
Sit with that contradiction for a second, because it's a real contradiction, and it's one that nobody in an official capacity has explained yet. Actually, wait, let me rephrase that, because I don't want you to walk away thinking this means the conditions weren't real. They were real. The medical evidence is real. 2 children had to be transported by helicopter to level 1 trauma centers because their injuries were that severe. 1 child had to be intubated. These are documented facts, not speculation. The contradiction isn't about whether something terrible happened. It's about whether the specific narrative being sold to the public that these were feral, mute, completely isolated children holds up against the evidence of actual internet activity. Both things can be true at once. That's the uncomfortable part. Severe neglect and internet access aren't mutually exclusive. But it does mean the full picture is messier than a 2-minute press conference soundbite can capture.
And I wanted to ask you about this too, because there's been reports, the Attorney General went on record and said those things, some of these children can't even speak. But then you spoke to the attorney for Gary Sr., who said, okay, some of these kids had social media. So what can you tell me about the condition of the kids that we know?
Yeah, I mean, their level of literacy and their ability to speak. I'm not so sure we have a definitive answer on that. some of the older children do have social media accounts. You know, the oldest child is 18, and then there's a 17-year-old, and if you do the math, the ages go down from there. And so I found social media accounts for what I believe are at least 3 of the older children. Definitely the 2 oldest children. And so there's not a lot of writing, if you will, typing regarding these kids. But there are a couple of posts here and there on these accounts where they're talking to somebody else. Somebody also shared some screen grabs of private messages between some of the children, the older children, and somebody else, a so-called internet boyfriend, whatever that means, somebody from overseas.
And that should make you angry. Not at the children, not even necessarily at the parents, not yet, not until we know more. Angry at a system that hands the public a tidy, horrifying narrative, gets millions of views and shares off it, and then quietly lets the actual complicated truth sit behind sealed documents for months while everyone moves on to the next headline. This wasn't an accident that a full picture didn't emerge right away. Not an accident at all. That's how these things always go. The horrifying soundbite gets the headline. The nuance gets buried in a court filing 3 months later that nobody reads. Let's talk about the charges for a second, because this is where the case starts to feel almost bureaucratic against the backdrop of everything else. All 4 adults, Gary Sr., Lynn, Gary Jr., and Elizabeth, were charged with 16 identical counts of endangering children, 1 for each child, felonies of the 2nd degree. If convicted, they're each looking at 2 to 8 years minimum, up to 12 years maximum on every single count. Do that math. 16 counts each. The exposure here is staggering, at least on paper. And yet, when Gary Sr. and Gary Jr. appeared in court for the first time, they barely spoke. When the judge asked how they pled, they said almost nothing, hardly reacting even as bond was set at $300,000 cash or surety each. Elizabeth was different. Elizabeth tried to argue. The judge stopped her almost immediately, reminding her of her right to remain silent, telling her flatly that this was not the time to argue her case. That single exchange, more than almost anything else in this entire case, tells you something about who these 4 people actually are as human beings sitting in that courtroom. 3 of them silent, resigned, maybe overwhelmed. One of them, the youngest, the one who was married at 15, trying to speak up, trying to say something, and being told to stop.
And then asked for a plea. And here's the part I played earlier in this episode when Elizabeth starts to talk back to the judge. I'll let it play out in full this time.
Do you understand these pleas? And how do you plead? Stop. First of all, I want to remind you of your right to remain silent. This is not the time for you to argue your case. These are serious allegations, and if you are unsure on what to do, I will enter a not guilty plea for you until you can consult with counsel. Okay? I also need to advise you that because these cases came before this court on a complaint, as opposed to through an indictment by the grand jury, you have the right to a preliminary hearing. And that's a matter you can discuss with counsel once they're appointed as well. All right? All right. So I will enter not guilty pleas for both of you at this time until you have the opportunity to discuss this case with counsel.
Here's a question nobody in the mainstream coverage of this case seems willing to sit with for more than 10 seconds. What was she trying to say? We don't know. And here's the thing, though. We may never know because bond hearings move fast and courtrooms don't leave room for explanations, only pleas. Now let's talk about Gary Sr., because his story adds another layer to this that a lot of outlets have quietly skipped past. 73 years old. During a transport to a preliminary hearing, he fell. Medical staff discovered a serious condition requiring specialized care outside the local area. His attorney has filed for a competency evaluation, and there's discussion of a potential insanity defense, which doesn't mean, as his attorney was careful to clarify, that anyone thinks he's simply crazy. It means there are real, documented questions about whether a 73-year-old man with apparent hearing difficulty, mobility issues, and possible cognitive impairment, even understood what was happening around him during his own arraignment. And this is where the county's problem becomes almost darkly ironic. Because in Ohio, when a defendant is held in county jail, the county pays for their medical care. Prisons for convicted people get state funding. Jails for the accused don't. And Vinton County, one of the poorest counties in the entire state, was suddenly facing a medical bill for a 73-year-old man with a serious condition that officials openly said could, quote, potentially bankrupt the county.
His medical care could potentially bankrupt Vinton County.
This was a new update just this week when Gary Sr. was given bond and taken to the hospital.
Gary Siders Sr., the older Gary Siders, was provided with a bond today, an OR bond. Let me explain the circumstances around that. First, let me stress, the community is not at risk because of this bond. Yesterday, as you all know, the cases were scheduled for preliminary hearing. During the transport, Mr. Siders fell and had a medical issue that required treatment and assessment. O'Glennis Hospital was where he was taken, and it was determined at that point upon some tests that O'Glennis did that Mr. Siders Sr. has a serious medical condition that requires specialized care in a hospital outside of this area. Practically, and I don't know if you folks know this or not, but when defendants are housed in county jails, it is the county's responsibility to pay for the medical care. Prisons are for defendants who have been convicted. Then the state pays for it. But he's still an innocent man that has not been convicted yet. So the county was going to be on the hook for his medical care. And again, based on the information that we were provided, his medical care could potentially bankrupt Vinton County. We were not going to put that burden also on our local taxpayers.
So they released him on what's called an OR bond own recognizance, not because he's not dangerous. The prosecutor was careful to stress that, but because the county literally could not afford to keep him behind bars while he received care. Think about that for a second. A rural county so under-resourced that it had to weigh the cost of holding an accused child abuser against literal fiscal collapse. That's not a detail about one family. That's a detail about how this country treats its poorest communities, and how those communities are left to handle crises that would strain resources in a wealthy city, let alone a county of 13,000 people. You already know what I'm about to say, just like I know it too. This isn't just a story about one house of horrors in rural Ohio. This is a story about what happens when poverty, isolation, and a broken rural safety net collide, and how easy it becomes for something like this to hide in plain sight for 4 years while nobody notices. 4 years. That's how long this family had been in that specific house in Vinton County. 4 years of neighbors saying they had no idea children lived there. 4 years of a 12 by 12 room housing more human beings than most apartments. 4 years, and it took a search warrant for something completely unrelated to finally crack it open. And here's the part nobody talks about. What was actually the target of that original investigation? We still don't know. The affidavit is sealed. The warrant itself is sealed. A judge signed an order keeping both hidden from public view, and there is no publicly stated timeline for when, or if, that will change. Investigative journalist Ann Genevieve, who has been closer to this case than almost anyone in the media, said it herself. Nobody knows why they went there. Nobody knows who the actual target of that initial investigation was. All anyone can say for certain is that when they arrived to serve that warrant, they found something they were not expecting to find at all. Doesn't that bother you? It bothers me. It genuinely does, and I'll admit that much to you directly, because I don't think you can report on a story like this and stay completely detached from it. There's something deeply unsettling about a legal system that will hold a press conference calling something pure evil, will use words like feral and livestock in front of live cameras, and then turn around and refuse to let the public see the actual document that started the entire chain of events. You can't have it both ways. You can't ask the public to trust the characterization of the horror while keeping the paperwork that justifies your presence there completely hidden. That's the part they don't want you thinking about too hard, because once you start asking why the warrant is sealed, you start asking what else is being managed carefully for public consumption. And once you start asking that question about one case, you start asking it about every case. Let's go back to the kids for a moment, because ultimately, whatever the legal mess around this family turns into, 16 children are the ones who lived it. Ages 1.5 to 18.5. Elizabeth was pregnant nearly every single year from 2008 through 2025. 2008, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2016, 2017, 2020, and then 2022, 2024, and 2025 with twins in 2 of those years. One set of those twins, born in November of 2022, Bailey and Faith, were conjoined, born prematurely, died of natural causes shortly after birth in a hospital, not at home.
Let's first talk about the kids. According to officials, they don't even have access to birth certificates for all of the kids. But from the information we're gathering, there are 16 total. And that means Elizabeth Siders was pregnant almost every single year from 2008 until 2025. Here's how it all breaks down. She had children in 2008, 2009, 2011, 2012, 2013, 2014, 2016, 2017, 2019, 2020, and in 2022, 2024, and 2025, she had twins. And I will note that the twins born on November 20th, 2022, Bailey and Faith, were conjoined twins born at the hospital. Now, they were born prematurely and died of natural causes.
There may have been additional stillbirths that investigators are still trying to confirm. Sit with the sheer physical toll of that. A body carrying, birthing, and in some tragic cases losing child after child after child for 17 years straight, starting at age 15. Whatever else is true about Elizabeth Siders, whatever role she played in what happened inside that house, that is not a normal reproductive history for any woman. That is the biography of someone whose entire adult life and a good portion of her childhood was consumed entirely by pregnancy and childbirth. And here's where the picture gets even more complicated, because Prosecutor Archer, when directly asked whether Elizabeth herself might be considered a victim in all of this, gave what Anjanette Levy described as a strange, almost coded answer. He said, her attorney says she's not a victim. But what her attorney has actually said is that his office is still investigating whether she was one. That's not a direct answer. That's a prosecutor very carefully leaving the door open, whether intentionally or not, to the idea that the woman being charged as a co-defendant might also simultaneously be one of this case's victims.
Which I find interesting. I will be very interested given the fact that, during one of the press conferences, somebody asked Prosecutor Archer, the Vinton County prosecutor, something like, her attorney's saying you're investigating whether Elizabeth is a victim. And he kind of had a really interesting response to that. He said, well, her attorney says she's not a victim. But what her attorney has said is that he's still investigating whether she was a victim. So that made me wonder if the prosecuting attorney is kind of tipping us off a little bit, saying, like, look, this lady's not a victim. We don't know that for sure. But I'm wondering if the prosecutor is going to file a response to that motion saying, no, we oppose this motion. That's what I'm wondering.
Now here's the everything makes sense now moment. The one where all these threads start pulling together into something bigger than just one strange family in rural Ohio. This is what happens when isolation, poverty, generational patterns, and a justice system stretched paper thin all collide in the exact same place at the exact same time. A county too small and too under-resourced to have caught this earlier. A family that moved repeatedly across counties and even into another state, leaving no single agency with the full picture of their history. A child bride who became a mother of 16 before she was even old enough to fully understand what a healthy childhood was supposed to look like. A grandfather whose own competency to stand trial is now in question. And a legal system that, even now, months into this, still won't let the public see the one document that started the entire chain of events. This is not a story about one evil family in a horror movie house. This is a story about every crack in the system that had to align perfectly for years for this to remain hidden. And once you see it that way, you start to understand why the details keep contradicting each other. Why the AG's office describes feral, mute children while the defense produces Facebook accounts. Why officials say livestock had it better while attorneys insist there's, quote, no sign of a house of horrors. Both sides are telling a version of the truth that serves their purpose, and the actual reality, the one those 16s actually lived through every single day for 4 years in that county, sits somewhere in the space between those two competing narratives, waiting for a grand jury that hasn't even been convened yet.
The grand jury is a secret process. We do not disclose specifics on that. We hope to be having information for that within the next couple of weeks. What I will tell you is this is not Franklin County, who has grand juries every day practically. Normally, Vinton County has a grand jury every other month, which is why the preliminary hearing issue came up, is because we don't have grand jury that often, and by right, the defendants have the ability to have that hearing.
And that grand jury is secret too. By law in Ohio, grand jury proceedings are not disclosed. Vinton County, being as small as it is, only convenes a grand jury roughly every other month, which is part of why this case is moving so slowly through the preliminary stages in the first place. So even the next major step in this legal process is going to happen entirely behind closed doors, with the public finding out only after decisions have already been made. Doesn't that just confirm what you already suspected? That's so much of what actually determines justice in this country happens in rooms you and I will never be allowed into. Sealed warrants, secret grand juries, HIPAA laws preventing us from knowing Gary Sr.'s actual medical condition, attorney-client privilege shielding whatever Elizabeth actually told her lawyer about what happened in that house. Layer after layer of legal protection, some of it entirely legitimate, some of it convenient for people who'd rather the full truth stay buried a little longer. I want to be honest with you about something, and this is the part that feels personal to me, the part I wasn't sure I should even say out loud. When I first read about this case, my gut reaction was pure anger. Straightforward, uncomplicated anger at 4 adults who let 16 children live like that, and some of that anger is still justified. I'm not walking it back. Children were hurt. Some of them nearly died. That's not in dispute by anyone, defense included. But the more I dug into Elizabeth's story specifically, the 15-year-old bride, the 17 straight years of pregnancy, the brother calling it an indoctrination, the prosecutor's strange non-answer about victimhood, the angrier I got started shifting somewhere else entirely, not away from the horror inside that house, toward the question of how a 15-year-old girl ends up crossing state lines to marry an 18-year-old man in the first place, and why nobody, not a school, not a doctor, not a single government agency across multiple counties in one different state, ever intervened in the 17 years that followed. That's the part that really gets me. Not the shock value of feral children and bug-covered floors, the quiet, slow-motion failure of every single system that was supposed to catch this. And it did nothing. For 4 years in that specific house, and honestly for far longer than that if you trace the full timeline of Elizabeth's life back to when she was 15 years old. So here's where I leave you today, because I don't have a neat resolution for you. I can't give you one. Nobody can, not yet. Not the prosecutor, not the defense attorneys, not the attorney general standing in front of cameras calling this pure evil. This case is still unfolding in real time, with a grand jury yet to be convened, a competency evaluation still pending for a 73-year-old man who may or may not have understood a single word of his own arraignment, and 16 children scattered into foster placements across a system that was never built to absorb that many kids from one single family at once. And there's still that sealed warrant sitting there, unexplained, months later. Still no public answer for what investigators were actually looking for that day in June. Still no accounting for why the state's top law enforcement official felt comfortable using words like feral and livestock in front of cameras, while the actual document justifying his agency's presence in that home remains locked away from the very public he was addressing. You already know what I'm going to ask you. You know, just like I know. So I'll ask it plainly. If the system was working the way it's supposed to, why did it take an unrelated, sealed search warrant to stumble onto 16 children living like this for 4 straight years in a county, in a state, in a country that claims to protect its most vulnerable? And if Elizabeth Siders really was a child bride who spent 17 years pregnant almost without pause, starting at age 15, why is anyone still debating whether she's a victim or just another name on a list of defendants? Tell me in the comments what you think really happened inside that house and whether you believe Elizabeth Siders is a perpetrator, a victim, or something the justice system doesn't even have a proper word for yet, because I don't think this story is over. I think we've only seen the parts they were willing to let us see.